Well, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for what is the final event in a strong series of public talks and dialogues, which we have called Iconoclash. This has been a programme devised by UNIC, I'll tell you what that is in a moment, with our colleagues at New York University, and all taking place in New York, NYU's splendid DC campus here. And I want to thank NYU immediately for their partnership throughout the series, including tonight, and particularly Tom McIntyre and Alexis Nicholson. I also want to express my respect to my colleagues at UNIC. I'm Paul Smith, Director of the British Council, by the way, and that is one of the constituent organisations of UNIC. UNIC, EUNIC, is the European Union National Institutes of Culture, and it brings together those organisations from Europe that operate in parts of the world, including here in Washington, DC, as specific cultural entities. Organisations like the Goethe Institute, of which my friend Wilfried is the director, the Alliance Française, the Italians, the French, the Austrians, most of us, and the British Council in my case. So I want to thank my colleagues at UNIC for enabling such a potent series of intellectual debates and interventions through this Iconoclash, a real look into the interface between culture and crisis, culture and conflict, and today culture and everything one might mean by that, and peace building in the modern world. In most parts of the world, these UNIC groups usually just do things like arranging film festivals or European concerts of music, but I'm very proud of the UNIC colleagues in DC who always determined to look at some broader and more geopolitical issues of our time, as in this Iconoclash programme. And the next programme, which we have over the next 6 months in Washington, which will be considering the protection of cultural heritage. Now, it's clear that in the 21st century, questions of culture have gone from the margins of international affairs to the centre. The matters that underscore and the issues that underscore some of the traumas of our day have to do with things like inclusion and exclusion, concepts of home, concepts of the other, questions of value systems, questions of faith, mobility, diversity, changing demographies, above all, perhaps, that capturing word, identity. These are cultural questions as much as they are economic or political questions. So it's right that cultural organisations these days mobilise some thinking around such questions as tonight's, overcoming Islamic extremism towards a new period of peace building. And we're really privileged and pleased to have with us tonight two extraordinarily appropriate specialists and speakers from both sides of the pond, as we say, from both Europe and the USA. Let me first introduce briefly Courtney. Courtney Beale is the Senior Director of the Global Engagement Office and Special Assistant to the President at the National Security Council. In that role, Courtney oversees the US government's public diplomacy efforts to engage and to influence citizens and non-state actors in support of national security goals. Courtney has previously worked as the Director of the Office of Strategic Planning in the Public Affairs Bureau and has had many other important professional positions in this sector. And she has also been a senior diplomat in a range of countries: Mexico, Islamabad, Colombia, and India. It's a privilege to have you with us, Courtney. And then I want to introduce from my country, from the UK, Dr. Ben O'Loughlin, who is the Professor of International Relations at Royal Holloway College, which is one of the great colleges of the University of London, where he has been for 8 years. He is a DPhil in politics at the University of Oxford. And one of the most interesting other professional activities that Ben is currently engaged in, he's a specialist advisor to the UK House of Lords Committee on soft power, UK government's House of Lords Committee on Soft Power and UK Influence. He did this for 2 years and produced a major report on power and persuasion in the modern world. So those are our two speakers and discussants tonight, and I now want to hand over to Wilfried Eckstein, who is the director of the Goethe Institute in Washington and a prime deviser of this iconoclash series of events. And I'd love to say that Wilfried is indefatigable in creating programs which help us navigate the choppy waters between culture and international issues of our times. And he's the perfect moderator for tonight's program. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, very much for the introduction and the kind words. And without further ado, I think I would like to start our discussion and not lose time because it's so precious. And thank you again also on my side for making it possible to be here, Courtney, and also Ben for coming over to be here and discuss with us. Courtney, may I ask you to simply start? Thank you. Please welcome her.
Well, good evening. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thanks to NYU, the British Council, UNIC, DC, the EU delegation to the US, and Goethe Institute for supporting this event. It's really an honor to be with you here tonight to discuss this topic. As a diplomat for the State Department who has served overseas in many capacities, including in countries like Pakistan and Colombia, where I've seen firsthand the devastation caused by violent extremism, but also the everyday heroes who are helping to fight extremism and reduce radicalization. This is an issue that's really close to my heart. I think today our biggest global threat comes from violent non-state actors and the inability of fragile states to respectively respond to them. So first and foremost, when we look at solutions, we need a strong policy framework to strengthen fragile states and communities while also defeating terrorist groups on and off the battlefield. And public diplomacy plays an important role. Tonight, I'd like to address how we use in the US government cultural programs, exchanges, network building, communications, and social media toward these goals. And because Wilfried tells me that many of you are practitioners or one day will be practitioners, I'll give you a couple examples from US government public diplomacy programs as well. But before I talk about that, I want to first define some terms. It looks like many of you are students, and I'm reminded of my university days when my professor told me that you always have to be very careful to define your terms. And so when I saw the topic of tonight's panel, I felt as though interacting with Islamic fundamentalism, as referenced in the panel topic, is very different than countering violent extremism. And public diplomacy is crucial for both, but the tools, the content, and the messengers that we use in our public diplomacy are very different. And for me, the distinction between the two is that Islamic fundamentalists don't necessarily condone violence. We may not agree with Islamic fundamentalists in all their beliefs, but we don't denounce a group unless they resort to violence. American values don't reject a religious group for beliefs, even if they may be fundamentalists, as long as they do not employ or advocate violence. And this is an important distinction because there are many Muslim communities around the world that are being told that we are waging war on the religion of Islam or that we do not accept Muslims. And 15 years after 9/11, we know that language matters. As the president has said, we're not at war with Islam, we're at war with a group that perverts the ideology of Islam, the religion of Islam. So to improve ties with Muslim communities, even fundamentalist communities, we use public diplomacy tools to build understanding and dialogue between the United States and a country and the American people with Muslim communities around the world. On the other hand, when a group does resort to violence, then we are compelled to denounce them. Terrorist organizations such as ISIL or Al-Shabaab manipulate religious ideology to advance violence, prey on vulnerable communities, and create falsehoods and propaganda to support their violent mission. But the threat from violent extremists requires a different approach to public diplomacy. When we look at communities that are prone to radicalization, we know that governments, the United States government, is not the best messenger. Imams, peers, teachers, social media influencers have much greater impact. So we need to build partnerships with these groups to give them information, training, and support, project their own positive narratives, discredit the narratives of violent extremism, and ultimately reduce radicalization. So before discussing how we counter violent extremism through public diplomacy in more detail, I'll talk through a few ways that we use public diplomacy to improve relationships with Muslim communities around the world. And first is through the communications that we employ as a government. There is massive misinformation in the media. Most connected communities around the world actually have too many information sources rather than too few. In a recent speech, Secretary of State John Kerry remarked that today we live in a global fishbowl where truth does battle with myths everywhere and competing myths fight against one another. He emphasized, it is absolutely vital that the truth emerge and facts be known, because otherwise people just make up stuff to feed whatever propaganda they want. And so the United States government supports journalism training around the world with some of our largest programs in Muslim countries. We strive for transparency in communicating our own policies, and we're very careful about the language that we use. Just one example, President Obama does not call violent extremism radical Islamic terrorism, because the ideology of terrorist groups does not comport with mainstream Islamic thought, and we don't want to fuel the narrative that the US is at war with a religion. Although I will acknowledge that election seasons here don't make that any easier. Programmatically, we focus on areas of mutual interest, such as arts, culture, development, entrepreneurship, academics, to build trust between Muslim communities and the United States. So to dispel myths and misinformation and better understand the US and the American people, there's really no substitute for bringing people here to our country. Most of our largest exchange programs are with Muslim countries, and we look for audiences for these programs who are government and non-governmental leaders today, as well as the emerging group of leaders for tomorrow. So just to give a few examples, a year or so ago, we brought a group of Iraqi imams from important parts of the country over to the United States so that they could see firsthand how Americans feel about Islam, so that they could meet imams in the United States, so that they could better understand the United States of America and how we think about Islam, Iraq, countering ISIL, community safety, and policing. And we wanted them to be able to go back and share with their communities their perspectives after having been here in the United States. Another example from my time in Pakistan is that we brought a hip-hop group that had a massive social media following to the United States to perform and share their music for Americans. And after they went back, they were able to tell about their experiences in America to hundreds of thousands of Pakistanis to help reduce misinformation and dispel the stereotypes that youth in Pakistani had about our values and our culture. So these are just two anecdotes, but we hope that when we multiply them by the tens of thousands of people who participate in US public diplomacy programs every year, that we can overcome the gaps of trust and build dialogue with Muslim communities around the world. So building ties with moderate Muslim communities is exceptionally important, but I think the bigger challenge is how to actively counter the threat from violent extremism. Public diplomacy plays a role in three areas. First, understanding radicalization and narratives. Second, empowering influencers that can discredit those narratives and prevent radicalization. And third, amplifying positive alternatives to violent extremism. So the first step in any public diplomacy process is to listen and to understand your audience. This requires giving our practitioners access to research on radicalization and narratives, as well as intelligence and data on how it is influencing vulnerable communities. So the US launched a network of researchers from around the world collaborating on ways to counter and prevent violent extremism last year at the US Institute of Peace, right nearby here in Washington, D.C. The network, called Researching Solutions to Violent Extremism, or RESOLVE, is building knowledge on violent extremism in local contexts and strategies for opposing it. But we also need to understand the narratives that ISIL and other terrorist groups project, how these narratives interact with local grievances to fuel radicalization, and the methods to spread their message through traditional and social media and individualized interaction. Intelligence and data tells us that this is very different in every context, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach. But through research and experience, we have learned that both the message and the messenger are very important. And when it comes to individuals at risk of radicalization, the US government is not the right messenger. So the second step is to identify and empower influencers that can discredit narratives and prevent radicalization. The good news is that there are religious leaders, youth activists, civil society organizations, and educators that are stepping up to do just this. They are credible voices in their community. And whether it's online networks of Mothers Against ISIL to defectors speaking out about why they left terrorist groups, we do best by supporting their efforts. Now, the context for terrorist recruitment in northern Nigeria and Molenbeek are different, but these local groups know what positive alternative narratives will resonate best in their community. But usually they need support, grants, training, networks, and given the growing influence of online propaganda, many need support to take their messages and their movements online as well. So public diplomacy tools can help, both online and offline. To share a few examples, last year we built a network of women working to fight extremism in their own communities because we understand the pivotal role that women play in countering extremism and bringing stability to communities. These women were able to learn from peers in the United States as well as each other, find additional ways to support each other's work across borders, and learn about best practices in community safety and outreach, public relations, and community organizing. Another program that the US government and the State Department work in is called the Peer-to-Peer Challenging Extremism Project. And this takes university students from around the world to work through a semester-long program to better understand violent extremism and create and amplify their own online CVE projects. Through an international competition that's co-sponsored by Facebook, the best projects then receive additional support. One of last year's winners, 195.com, runs social media and in-person education campaigns about CVE and gives young people the tools to connect across borders, cultures, and religions. The final example I'll share is the accumulation of many lessons learned in this area. In January, the US government launched the Global Engagement Center to replace the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications at the Department of State. But other than a shorter name, how is this new entity any different? We now clearly recognize that the information battle space is equally important as the physical battle space, and that global violent extremist groups are increasingly networked. We had not put the required priority and resources against this problem, and we've been conceding the information space to terrorist groups. So in response to ISIL's propaganda, the Global Engagement Center, instead of doing direct messaging as its previous version did, is much more focused on empowering and enabling partners, both governmental and non-governmental, to speak out against groups that espouse violence using both traditional and social media. Just as we'll be cultivating third parties in our messaging delivering efforts, we also need partners in the private sector. From Silicon Valley to Madison Avenue, we have a wealth of innovative thinkers in technology and marketing. And the new center has authorities to bring in human talent from the private sector into these efforts. The challenge is always, how do we actually know if this is working? As the director of the Global Engagement Center, Michael Lumpkin, says, this is the difference between simple and easy. Simple to say and not easy to do. With private sector tools and data analytics, the Global Engagement Center will be much more focused on measuring results, changes in sentiment. But much like a startup, we want to innovate, measure, and either fail quickly or ramp up what we think is working. Lastly, we also acknowledge that we can't do this alone. Terrorist organizations and radicalized individuals are increasingly networked, and it takes a network to defeat a network. So we're working to build a network of governments, civil society organizations, and others working to defeat violent extremism by empowering local voices, building partnerships, providing counter-narratives, and articulating a shared vision for a better world, a world that respects all religions while providing opportunities for all people. Thank you for this opportunity to share these thoughts with you tonight.
Okay, thank you. Also, obviously, it's quite hard to follow the White House in these matters. We were just in the green room before we came on, and they had the photos of the previous speakers, and Zizek and Martin Scorsese. So this must have been there was a photo of Martin Scorsese next to some of the others. So this must have been a very successful series. So well done to the organisers. So my contention today, obviously this series has been about culture and communication and conflict, as David said earlier. And today we're thinking about how this can be used in peace building in the future. And Courtney's outlined some of the actual initiatives that are going on right now. I'm somebody who does believe that culture and communication can make a difference in terms of peace building. Just to give an example, if you look at what President Obama did to reach the Iran deal, certainly in Europe, we've been trying to reach this deal since 2004 probably. For Iran, the problem is communication more than anything. They have wanted acknowledgement that their problem with the West is because we did bad things, particularly the US and the UK in 1953 and a little bit after 1979. The Iranian leadership have been saying consistently since 2004, 2003, if you just acknowledge that, if we can agree that that's what's happened, then we can make peace over the nuclear program. And our government wouldn't do it for a long time, and then Obama in his first term couldn't really say that. And there was lots of talk of clenched fists. Iran, if you will unclench your fist, there was lots of metaphors going around. And then second term President Obama, he's like, all right, hands up, no more unclenching fists, or we'll do that. Yeah, we did some bad things back in 1953, sorry about that. And suddenly these doors opened, and by changing the narrative, or by creating a shared narrative with what the Iranian leadership and a lot of the Iranian public believed about what's happened to their country, by having that by listening, what Courtney was saying, and finding that narrative convergence, then we've got a peace deal, which frankly most people didn't think was possible. So I'm firmly believing that communication and culture can lead to peace building. But I'm going to go through some of the difficulties and some of the problems, some of the practical problems that we face at the moment. And so first of all, I want to start with the idea of contesting the space. And this is very big, both in Europe and in government here. The problem of fetishising the digital. I mean, it's great to have Facebook involved in everything. But if we look at an instance of radicalisation, who's going to Syria? This is certainly a problem in the UK, but I know you've been having it in the United States as well. Young people going to Turkey, going across the border, going to Syria. Certainly in the UK's case, they've pretty much all come from 3 towns. Can't really name those towns. I hope you'll let me off with that. But it's not the internet that is driving people to be radicalised. It seems to be communities. And this is where some of the community, the women's communities and things like that becomes really important. So the idea that by clamping down on Twitter or by doing something different on Facebook, you're going to stop radicalisation or its consequences is just not borne out by the facts. The most people that have gone to Syria in the last couple of years are from Tunisia. Internet penetration in Tunisia is down here somewhere. It's not the internet that is making people angry. It's conspiracy stories, ideas going around in their local community, and it's television, which is still really, really important. It's still the main medium for most people in the world. So first of all, we need to yes, digital is important, but we've got to, when we think about it, see it in the context of all kinds of other media and conversations going on. And it's great that, I mean, certainly Twitter in the last 12 months has absolutely clamped down on IS, Islamic State material and accounts. The people who are trying to keep these accounts going, a year ago they were distributing content relatively freely. Now they're battling extremely hard just to keep their accounts up. They don't have time to propagate. They're just trying to stay alive or stay in existence. So a lot of progress has been made, but digital isn't everything. Another issue in terms of contesting the space is using kind of local proxies, if you like. And this is another difficulty that is going to be on the table for the next 10 years, next 20 years. It's been on the table for the last 100 years. Using people in certain countries, in certain communities, whose interests may align with you and they may want to help you build security, for example, or whatever aim you've got. But I don't know, are they overtly funded by you? We were talking about this before we came on. We have a problem in the UK or an issue. Say we want to have some influence in a country in the Middle East. You can launch funding campaigns to sponsor NGOs or train clerics in dealing with certain local problems. But there's also, if that's done overtly, brilliant. But I want to put on the table that this also goes on covertly as well, that PSYOPs haven't gone away, that information warfare hasn't gone away. Certainly I have the sense that my country does this, so I would imagine that the United States probably does as well, in that you can set up NGOs that will then fund other NGOs such that the other NGOs don't really know where the money originally came from. I think this is something that's going to go on and on and on. And insofar as public diplomacy, which is supposed to be about your government talking to publics in other countries and helping them kind of, build civil societies and whatever else they want, there's still a kind of information ops / public diplomacy difficulty that in the actual operational world is going on. I'd be very interested to hear what you think about that and whether it's legitimate really to be paying people to kind of be on your side, and if given the stakes with the conflicts that we've got going on at the moment. Second big issue is understanding communication, and what have we learnt from the war on terror in terms of how persuasion works? Well, 80 years ago, the great US political communication people, Lazarsfeld and Berelson and people like that, just after the Second World War, they wrote that to be able to persuade, you can persuade some people under some circumstances who are talking to certain people who are exposed to some content. So if you take all of those, the idea that if you start addressing 1 million followers on Twitter, you might persuade 2 of them once you go through all of those kind of junctures. So there's been extremely unrealistic expectations about how effective counter-narrative battles can be, given that most people, we know this from political communication, and this is where international relations and foreign policy can learn from communication studies. We know that most people's opinions are really entrenched. They don't change much over their lifetimes. So the idea that having some kind of new TV station set up is going to change anyone's mind in a certain country is not supported by any evidence, and it's really, really difficult. So I just want to kind of put on the table that there's a need to manage expectations about what difference these can make. And obviously we want to be seen to be doing something and projecting and saying the right thing, but actually making any difference by doing that is unlikely. Also in terms of communication, there's Courtney talked about the resolve problem and the new centre, and another thing just to put on the table is that certainly, in our country, I think it's the same here, every 3 to 4 years there's a new centre for, right now it's countering violent extremism. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it was COIN, it was counterinsurgency, because Afghanistan and Iraq were the big things. In the 1990s, it was something else. At least every decade, I think more quickly than that, we go through a whole new wave of, there's radicalisation, or there's violent extremism, or in 5 years we'll be calling it something else. We need to do loads of studies on this. What is this new terrible thing? And there's a kind of institutional forgetting that has been going on for the last 15 years, and how that can be overcome, how within the departments in your government here or across NATO and across the alliance, we can actually realise that there's been 50 years of studies of radicalisation. It's not something new. We kind of know how this has worked in all kinds of post-colonial situations. So how do we build on this? I mean, communication, you can get it right, but it still seems to not be taken that seriously, such that it gets reinvented. I was speaking to some people in the Army College this morning, and they were saying, if you look at the people at the top of the military, although we say that communication matters, they're not there because they're great at communication. They're there because they're good at hard power. So at what point are we going to get the people who, if language is as important as the actual kinetics, which we've heard, at what point do the specialists of language get to the top of your military as well as the specialists in kinetics, in hard power? I think at that point, when you have generals who have come from Google or from Facebook or from I don't know where, then you can say you're taking communication seriously. But right now, that's not happening. Final kind of area to talk about is the role of media in kind of amplifying or containing conflict. And this is something that, again, hasn't really changed much. I mean, in the kind of the programme for today, we're looking at what have we learned through the war on terror and what can we learn from the future. We still find that although journalists are lovely people, are there any journalists in the room? All right, so maybe they're not that nice. But although they're lovely people and they want peace, the way in which our media systems work amplify, sensationalise, dramatise. And so something like Islamic State, if the people who really know about it, the people who study it, who work in intelligence on it, who know it, often most Islamic State politics is pretty boring. It's bureaucratic. It's how do we set up a state in a really difficult position. They might, we see the sensational videos of the beheadings. Certainly through 2014-15, this was what the public saw. Journalists are beginning to get a bit more responsible now. But Islamic State are not particularly Islamic. They might say sometimes in some of their videos that, we're destroying these artifacts because they're idolatrous and they go against our religion. But if we actually chart what Islamic State have blown up, most of the stuff that we think they've blown up, they haven't, or they've taken 6 months to wait for the right opportunity in our domestic politics before blowing something up. So if that thing was really so sinful, why didn't they blow it up to begin with? No, this is tactical, this is political, this is realpolitik. Our journalists and our media don't report Islamic State in that way. So what kind of journalism could do that? Again, we were having another discussion this morning at a separate event. How can journalists tell a more positive story about the West in general? Because you mentioned the campaign in the United States right now. It's not great public diplomacy with what's going on with obviously the primaries right now. Certainly in the UK and Europe, we're in crisis. We have the refugee crisis, we have the financial crisis, we have Brexit and Europe possibly falling to pieces. So if communication could make a difference to kind of young people who are vulnerable to radicalisation, who are thinking, right, I want a really exciting life, I've got no excitement in the West, it's all corrupt, you've got these fools running for office, everything, I'm not going to get a job, right, let's have some adventure. Let's go to Syria or Yemen or wherever. Well, how could we offer adventure in the West? How can we offer something a bit more inspiring? And I think this is one of the themes of this series as well. In what is Western culture? What is Eastern culture? Is there some kind of clash? With the journalists I was very fortunate to speak to this morning, they were really struggling with this. They were thinking, right, we believe in democracy. How can we do stories that show democracy works, given what's happening in the electoral campaign? Because it looks as though democracy isn't really working very well. So could we find like local people doing democratic things that aren't anything to do with elections, but show that civil society works in a democratic way? Would that be persuasive to young people who might be vulnerable to radicalisation? So again, I'd like to throw this open for discussion. What would a good news story about the West be anymore? Because right now there don't seem to be any. To wrap up, one of the things I think that needs to be done, and I say this with an interest because this is what I'm working on at the moment with our team at the University of London, is trying to get at the narratives held at ground level by ordinary people. I don't believe that charting changes of sentiment, we've been doing that for decades, it makes no difference. Showing that people in a certain country are favourable to you, and then they become more favourable or less favourable. Or, I mean, do they like milk more than beer? Or it's extremely flimsy. And a lot of kind of foreign policy research of public opinion is still at this level of sentiment analysis. What I think over the next decade needs to be done, and we've started doing this, is although we look at state narratives and we look at the Islamic state narratives, nobody is listening to ordinary people's narratives in Yemen or in Iraq. I'm not just talking about whether they're pro or anti-American. By narrative, I mean, what is their sense of where their country was, where is it now, and where is it moving to the future? What do they see as the challenges? What do they see as the happy ending, the sad ending, the disastrous ending? Where would they like to be going? If it was possible for research to do that, rather than just looking at pros or cons or favourable, less favourable, then we might be able to start on doing what Courtney asked for, which is listening. You can't listen, or, well, we're just not listening. You need to actually hear the stories through which people experience their own lives, their country's lives, and the way in which the international system is heading. Because until we do that, if we just rely on surveys, then we can't listen, and therefore we can't take into account. So that, I think, is the big thing for the next decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Courtney, do you want to react to him? Do you have something on your mind that you want to spontaneously say, or should I?
No, I think Ben's work on narratives is brilliant, and this makes for a much less interesting panel, but I agree with most of what he said.
All right. I would like to start with the listening term, because you mentioned it first, and I made a note. Oh, here it is, the listening term. I'm very interested in this story about the imams from Iraq. I think it's a very interesting story. Yeah. But I would like to ask the question, what did we in the West, what did we learn during the time when they were here? And this is a question that I also would ask to all those fellows that come to certain NGOs and are being hosted here as fellows for a year. They do work, they're probably having a great time. Will always look back to the United States as a wonderful experience, and they will have gotten new training and all that. But what do we learn during the time that they are here? How do we gather information and educate our hosts or those that invited the imams, for example?
That's a great question, because it's a really important part of an exchange program, is that we want Americans to have a better understanding of the rest of the world. I think there's a statistic like something like 35% of Americans have passports. So if not everybody is going to go abroad, then we hope by bringing more foreigners here to the United States and exposing people to kind of the richness of culture and diversity around the world, that Americans are going to learn equally, if not more, than our international visitors. You know, I think what both sides take away is the complexity, that we often think of things in simple narratives, that's how we process the world. And so we think of things as black or white. People from this country are good or bad. Americans are fat or lazy. And so I think what an exchange program can do is expose you to the fact that it's not that simple, that the answer is much more complex, which will, in the long run, whether you're the American or the Iraqi imam, make you question things a little bit more, or second guess, or try to learn a little bit more. Maybe not accept a narrative that you're being fed or misinformation that you heard as being the absolute truth, but reflect upon your experience or try to learn things in different ways based on your time being exposed to something new and different, whether it's international visitors coming to our country or the other way around.
Mm-hmm. I would like to stick to the listening paradigm. You opened up your explanation and your discovery about strategic narratives with Obama's speech in Cairo, where you said, well, in a way, he acknowledged that something went wrong. So my question to you is, how much do we have to acknowledge in relation to, let's say, well, the heritage of imperialism, of colonialism, and with all those anti-Western ideology or historical teaching? how much do we have to acknowledge?
It depends which country we're talking about,
Okay.
because if you're the superpower who is expected to police world order, or at least expects to police world order yourself, you can listen, but you can't really give in to too much. Whereas if you're a kind of middle level country like Britain or Germany or Norway or Japan or something, then there's less to lose. So what I'm getting at here is you can listen, or you can hear, but to take into account, you've got to give a little. You've got to not just, I'm listening to you. You should be grateful for that. But I'm listening, and I've heard, and I'm going to act on what you want. Now, it's very difficult when you're a major power, great power, superpower to do that, because if you do that once, you have to do that to everybody. Whereas I think if you're alluding to the European countries with colonial histories like Britain, then we can kind of work our way through the wrongs, and we don't have so much to lose really by just saying, we did a bad thing. So I think it depends on what your country's sense of itself within the international system is. China can't really go around apologising for many things, and look at the difficulties with Japan over the last decade, because it's becoming like a superpower, the joint superpower, the G2 that we have now, basically. So again, it depends which country we're talking about. China can listen, but it can't just say, you have what you want. You have those islands. You have those islands. It's not really ours, because that's not what a superpower does. Having the more power you have, the more anxiety you have about losing power. Also, the anxiety about showing that you still have power. So if you have power, you have to demonstrate you have power. Otherwise, how do we know you have power? So it's very difficult being a very powerful country, because listening becomes a very difficult task, because you can listen, but you can't show that you've heard by taking into account and changing. So that's why the Obama-Iran example is quite unusual. It's very unusual for a leader to be have the comfort of a second term where he could kind of do that. I think most leaders don't get the chance to be that receptive and generous, really.
May I add one thing? Well, many of you may remember when President Obama first became president and went on his first overseas trips, and how while he was listening and acknowledging some of the difficulties of what had gone on in the administration before him, the Republican Party then severely criticized him from going on an apology tour around the world. And so I think your domestic politics comes into play there as well, and your strength as a leader within that domestic context for what you can acknowledge or give up.
Just to add, one of the paradoxes, of course, is that we're listening more than ever because of big data, because of digital. In a certain sense, we hear, or the state hears more than ever, and is able to process more, and technically could kind of listen more. But certainly within the major powers, we're all monitoring each other's public opinion at extremely granular levels. There's this kind of hall of mirrors going on where we're all using big data to analyse what public opinion, how it's shifting, how the dials are turning in different places. So we're in a moment where there's never been more listening, but that doesn't change anything, really, I don't think.
Is that working? Yeah. A similar question to this. I came across that in one of the reports from 2010 about, from Lord Lynch report, you probably know that. It's about the previous work of counter-terrorism activities. And there was the term of Muslim victimhood. That's something which is also a disturbing thing for policy and for our interaction with the Middle East. I mean, it's in a way a different angle that we are looking at now. So how does that play into your concept? How do we react to Muslim victimhood? And you mentioned a very different example where people feel they are left out. I mean, this is actually made even a policy nowadays. The foreign minister of Iran mentioned recently that, Muslim youth is marginalized in the West and all that. So there is this culture, being cultured actually, of Muslim victimhood? Is that something which is disturbing and something which ties into our interior policies?
I would be very troubled by that phrase, I think. Certainly in the US and the UK, if we look at the electoral politics and our Brexit situation, it's kind of white working class grievances and disenfranchisement and distrust of the establishment that is driving politics. It's not identity politics to do with religion necessarily that is the major thing. And I mean, is there Christian victimhood, Muslim victimhood? What is that? How many millions of people, billions of people are we talking about here? So, do you have an example of what?
No, it was what I found as a target of the policy to counter that notion.
You know, I think it is, I agree with Ben, and it reminds me of an exhibit that I saw that's opening, I think, this weekend here in Washington, D.C., and it's done by female Muslim artists from the Middle East and the United States who are protesting against the phrase, in some ways, Muslim victimhood. And the idea behind the entire art exhibit is that there is this narrative that women in the Middle East or Muslim women are oppressed because of covering or because of the religion. And so the art is showing how Muslim women are strong and have a voice. And it struck me that sometimes our characterizations of things like that can be deeply insulting to the people who we're referring to.
I would like to pick up one thing that Ben said. What would a good story about the West be? That ties back to when we had Slavoj Žižek here. He made it very clear that we need a more defensive, a more strong and more self-confident attitude to our own values. So how strong are we? And I mentioned that when we prepared this talk, that one of the universities in Britain has gone into the headlines for being not really defendant enough on Western values, for actually being a hub for, Muslim victimhood or Muslim radicalization. So there is an incident, actually, which one can use to start, how defendant are we? How strong are we? In a way, liberalism is the door where radicalism was kind of breeding from.
This is the future of civilization. So thinking about the situation you're talking about UK universities and there being Islamic fundamentalism?
Well, I'm talking about Westminster University, which had that reputation of, not being defendant enough on what was going on. It was in the context of Jihadi John, the guy who studied there, and...
So, I mean, part of the context for this is obviously that many students at the moment are I don't want to, it sounds harsh, but reporting being offended for things that maybe a generation ago wouldn't have been seen as necessarily quite so offensive, and the kind of vulnerability culture that's been written about a lot lately. I don't really want to go down that road, because I would there's the French theorist Chantal Mouffe, who makes the distinction between agonism and antagonism in democratic politics. Agonism, I mean, this goes back thousands of years, I'm sure you know, but agonism is where you agree to disagree, you disagree quite strongly, but you don't want the other person to be killed because of that. Antagonism is where it becomes actually, I not only disrespect your argument, I disrespect you, your right to make that argument, I would like you to be eliminated. That, I think, is where the line is. And I don't really know this University of Westminster story very well, but if it was the case that some students were saying, you're not allowed to come to our meeting, and if you do, we'll kill you, then obviously that's an awful thing. But if it's, you can come to our meeting, but I disagree absolutely with everything that you've got to say and how you say it, that's fine for me. That's agonism, that's democracy. I would start from that distinction and work outwards.
I think you will certainly have your own questions in this podium, so you'll have a chance. My question to the topic of today is also new era of peace building. What is the difference? Where are we now, and what will be the new hope of getting it better done than before? Courtney, wouldn't you try that?
That's a big question. You know, I think in many ways that Ben is right, that we have to be able to build on the lessons from the past of experiencing this over a long time. I honestly don't think that there's like a silver bullet of what we need to do differently for peace building. I think the challenge is that things only work when they're done in very long-term ways. And that's difficult with political cycles and very rapidly changing dynamics around the world. And I'm reminded of Colombia, where I served, and I was there towards the end of a 50-year civil war. And the United States government had been providing funding through Plan Colombia at that point for 10 or 15 years, and was finally starting to see, I was there in 2006 to 8, finally starting to see things turn around a little bit. And I'm not owing the Colombian turnaround to US assistance, but I think that part of it was a long-term bipartisan strategy to address security issues and development issues. And so I think the hope for peace building is to have governments, we were working with many international partners in Colombia all towards a common strategy. And so I think part of the solution is a very long-term investment in stabilizing and bringing peace to many of these communities and countries.
I'd go along with that, and just to add, I mean, one way of thinking about this is, although I was critical of the digital and its fetishization, there are all of these crisis mapping and conflict mapping kind of digital projects going on now, where we can see through various kinds of data that, you know, it goes back to Kenya in the elections in 2008-9, where through people's SMS phone messages and through various kinds of citizen journalism and blogs, you could see where there was a trouble point, and you could see where there was a flashpoint. And after the Haiti earthquake in 2009 as well, this is now standard mainstream for any humanitarian crisis operation. So we know that if the big data is telling us that there's something terrible here, we can send resources, we can send whatever is needed. That's conflict mapping, that's crisis mapping. But we're talking about communities and peace building. You could flip that on its head. Nobody is doing peace mapping. Nobody is saying, oh, this community works, even though everything around it is chaos. Something's keeping people together here. Somehow people have got goods, they've got water, they've got shelter, they've got some kind of thing going on. And this is where what you're talking about, NGOs and civil society, I think is really interesting, because surely it's at that ground level that that's where they are most effective. It's not coming from above. So I think, I don't know, I'm kind of suggesting a kind of change in vision and how we envision peace and conflict through this kind of digital moment that we're going through. How can we, rather than looking for where are the crises and how we solve them, could we look at, well, where is the cooperation and how do we expand that? There are various different ways of thinking about how we can kind of approach this, I think.
But one last question to this. I mean, this is changing the system of media, of supply and demand. The supply and demand issue is, in a way, people want that kind of sensation of bad stories. So how do you want to change that?
Change human nature.
Easy enough.
Please, any questions from the audience, please? Do we have microphones? Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Mike Springman. I guess it's on. I'm the author of Visas for Al-Qaeda, CIA handouts that rock the world. I've got to say I take issue with just about everything that's been said down there today. As I note in the book and in my interviews with RT this week and with Press TV this week, The United States of America and its repressive and repulsive allies in Southwest Asia are responsible for most of the terrorism in the region. And this is in large part due to the fact that the United States staffs its foreign service with people from the intelligence services. The current State Department Deputy Director for Ebola, for example, Andy Weber, he was a case officer in Jeddah when I was there. The American ambassador to Oman, Greta Holt, her background is Defense Intelligence Agency. She was my predecessor in Jeddah. The State Department rewards people who make problems. You've got, for example, Shayna Steinger, the woman in Jeddah who issued visas to 11 of the 15 hijackers that got their visas in Saudi Arabia. She's been promoted and still has a job with the State Department. So what we need to do to get peace in the world, to put an end to terrorism, is one, get the spooks out of the State Department, and two, stop this warfare all around the world. Every 40 months, the United States of America conducts a major military operation. And the Americans think, well, this is an ad hoc basis. We're dealing with bad people in Libya or bad people in Yemen. But in actual fact, the people who are being bombed have a different opinion, and so forth.
Thank you. Do you have a question to the panel?
Do I have a question?
Yes.
How can they justify what they said given the real world, and given my book, and given the fact that I've given real interviews to real people in real news services around the world?
So we got a reading to do. Thank you. Please, there's a... Up there? No?
Thank you. My name is Carl Mosfeld, and maybe my question gets to somewhat similar things, but in a different way. I'm interested in the institutional consequences of this. I mean, what do we actually do differently, and how do we organize the response? And I thought you both brought out the subtleties in the challenge and how hard it is, and how you need to work across many, many fronts, and short-term and long-term, and extremists and non-extremists, etc. So my question then is, if I put in somewhat more provocative terms, one could suggest that what really is going to determine this is straightforward policy coherence that is driven consistently over a long time. In other words, good government. So is the conclusion what you're saying that the whole notion of public diplomacy drops out of the equation to some extent? Do you understand the question?
Do you want to? So do I understand your question correctly that we need to focus on strengthening governance around the world, which is largely a government issue, and therefore not a public diplomacy is not an appropriate tool to strengthen governance and policy, which is at the heart of the issues we're talking about tonight?
Well, I would frame it in using knowledge of individuals. We talk about relationship building.
Yeah.
How do you build relationships? Well, you build them by being a good, authentic person interacting well with others.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So it's about being a holistically presented being. The same goes for countries.
Mm-hmm.
So limited resources. Do you put your effort on being a good, holistic being in the world? Or do you put your effort on setting up offices, combating specific issues with specific tools around the world? Of course you do both, but the question still makes sense, I think.
I'm sorry, I'm still struggling with the question. Maybe if I hear you answer it, I'll understand it.
So I despise the concept of soft power, even though I've been on a committee looking at it. But for many of you know the weaknesses of with this concept, I'm sure. But it sounds as though you're kind of putting a soft power argument there, that you rely on your attractiveness. If rather than trying to instrumentally influence people, if you just do things right, people will admire you and they'll want to work with you. Is that? Yeah. That's the best defense I've ever heard of soft power as a concept. So then we have to think about why is the world too complicated for that to happen, and why is our governance maybe not as good as it might be. But I mean, and this is where politics become. I mean, this is where the first question comes in, because a lot of the interventions that you're talking about we've signed up to responsibility to protect, R2P. These wars are interventions that we as an international community and our elected representatives have said human rights is more important now than sovereignty. So if human rights are being transgressed, then we have to do something either through the UN Security Council or locally in some way. Now, we can agree with that or disagree with that, but that's the political situation. And this is where we start doing things that don't look very nice, and this is where you start having to persuade foreign publics that R2P is more important than sovereignty, or if you don't agree with that, that sovereignty is more important than R2P. And it's politics, and it's unavoidable. So we can't have all of these things. All we can do is kind of see them as the horizon to aim towards. So, and it varies depending on the country. So maybe for Germany, which, you know, obviously for many reasons hasn't been intervening very much for the last 50, 60, 70 years, it's easier for Germany to present its culture to the world or its commerce to the world and just stand back and say, take it or leave it. We think it's quite good, but if you want to buy our stuff, if you want to work with us, cooperate with us on pandemics or food security or whatever, work with us. But for other countries, we've got different histories, different legacies, and so our kind of attractiveness is a bit more difficult to manage, I think.
Sorry,
Thank you.
because you are in the UK.
Can you use the microphone?
Yeah. You can't avoid that.
We all have to learn from them, having lived in both of your countries and studied at University of Canterbury. I think this is the point, and this is what the State Department, I'm telling you, in all due respect, your presentation was at the level of an undergrad in poli-sci or international affairs. And I do truly respect.
Please come to a question.
Yeah,
right?
but I do respect the term of fetishness, because I'm sitting here as a citizen, although I've lived in 7, 8 different countries, including one of the poorest economically, not culturally necessarily, and one of the wealthiest both economically and culturally in Germany, is over and over again, decades and a century, America's fetishness with technology, and that will solve it. And now that we've moved, I'm old enough to remember the AV guys and the geeks were way down the hall in public high school, right? Now I understand why they were kind of segregated. We've let the Mad Hatters, the social nerds, whatever you want to call them, mainstreaming, and now we got our government drinking the Kool-Aid that the Bill Gates and Mr. Facebook guy is the solution with the technology. Now I'm concerned, and I'd like some response on this, how this blowback in the, have either any of you seen the video or familiar with the history of Gladio, post-World War II Europe? Gladio. I think we have the 9/11 using it as a template, and I encourage everyone here to watch the video.
Could you
It's called
come
Gladio.
to the question, please?
So I'm very concerned about this kind of American arrested adolescent, that idealism that technology will solve all human problems. And I think this is one reason why we are failing. If one believes in empire and domination, and we need to change our definition of what power is. And I think this is the Donald Trumps of the world. What's happening in Europe, what's happening in Mexico, is there's trying to be a paradigm shift, but the power elite is still invested, paying your mortgages and all. So to wrap it up, in all due respect, I think the cultural divide, again, having lived many, many times, and I love the NHS, used to work there as a psychotherapist, by the way, down in Dorset as well as London. I think Britain, if you're going to be an empire and believe in this kind of primitive definition of power, we failed. Because we have as much of attention as the pre-adolescents that I work with in therapy. We don't have patience. We don't know how to listen. And all we think is if we're the bully on the block, that's all that matters, and the rest of the world is cool about domination. I give credit, if you're going to do empire, do it the way of the Byzantines or the Romans, who at least put roads down. Viaducts, all we do is destroy human beings and all.
All right.
Not that I support empire, but I'm really concerned
Thank
as
you.
an American about what we're hearing.
Thank you.
Because because I don't want to be a citizen of empire.
Hi, my name is Elias, and I will try to stick to 2 questions only. So one question, and both questions are actually inspired by friends. So one has to do with the point you made, Courtney, about the simple narrative, right? Because the world is complex, and many of the issues that we're grappling with around war and peace do tend to be complex. So I told this friend that I was attending this talk, and this friend is in Kenya, and this is what he said to me. He says, I've come to realize, well, it gives us 2 cents about violent extremism, and he's in high school. But he says, I've come to realize the only way to tackle extremism is by love, forgiveness, and money. And then he goes on to say, however, which reminds me, I'm supposed to see a documentary on drones and how they've been killing innocents. And then he goes on to talk about how he would react if his sibling, mother or father, were to be collateral damage. And so that does raise a question about how the drone policy complicates your line of work. And then the second part of my question has to do with pluralism in the Middle East, right? I have a friend, Mara Mouachar, who's now in Jordan and has worked a fair bit in the region. And he's talked about this notion that, with the Arab Revolution recently, one critical aspect that's been missing has been this understanding that we are either, part of this larger other, or there is no other. And so I'm wondering, to what extent do the politics, internal politics of these conflict-ridden regions complicate the larger question about peace?
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for the questions. So on the first question about drone policy, I think that it's something that is very difficult to deal with from a public diplomacy perspective, but is a reality of a country balancing counterterrorism and security and other foreign policy priorities. I think one of the biggest challenges in the past, particularly with the drone policy, and having served in Pakistan, I saw this first thing on the ground, is that we aren't able to talk very openly about it. We can't talk about how decisions are made or exactly how the program works. And so not having transparency around something, I think, fuels misinformation, fuels anger. And I think that while this president has used drones, and people may have very different feelings about whether we should, he has tried to move towards increasing transparency in the program for lots of moral and ethical and foreign policy reasons, but I think also so that we are able to better talk about it and explain it as we seek to do communications and public diplomacy around the world, but it's an extremely challenging issue. On your other question of how domestic politics and domestic dynamics in other parts of the world kind of fuel these issues and identity and the other, I mean, I think it's something that you absolutely cannot ignore, and it gets to the issues that Ben was raising of listening and understanding narratives. I mean, if you look, I think particularly sectarian tensions are one of the primary challenges that drive this, and how politics interacts with that in the Middle East. So I would say that it's absolutely something that anyone looking at this problem has to better understand in order to even try to help be part of the solution. Did you want to add?
Only that therefore means that we need very good contextual, cultural understanding of those countries, which, I mean, this is why I was talking about getting away from this fetishization of technology, because if we look at the Arab uprisings, and you can kind of assume that technology will do a certain thing, but if we look at the way people use social media in Syria compared to in Egypt, for example, the culture of kind of fear and obedience, or performed obedience in Syria, was so important, and it overrode everything compared to the more experienced political activism that was in Egypt. So you have to know really locally on the ground what, how culture informs politics, and how the habits of everyday life, and how people sense things which is kind of generational, and you really need good expertise for that. But without that, yeah, we just run into problems.
Hi, Justin Lee with the Bipartisan Policy Center. First of all, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. The talk was very enlightening. I guess I had a question about where you see the difference between hard and soft power. As I think it was Ben that had mentioned, you need more of these hard power people who understand the value of soft power. But I guess, so what would you see as the ideal mix between the two, the interaction between the two, given that public diplomacy seems to fall under the umbrella of soft power? How would that play off, the things that hard power can bring to the table?
You want to start?
Well, it totally depends on what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And I mean, in this town, I'm guessing we have Hillary Clinton's smart power as the paradigm. So if you don't know that, it's the idea that you kind of use them both in a smart way. So you might get your military to do soft power things, like just make sure a school is safe for education or something, or you might use your teachers to do a hard power thing, like make sure that students aren't being radicalized or something like that. So then things just get quite mushy and merged, and it's very, very difficult. But the principle is you have these two tools of statecraft, and you just use your intelligence, and it's kind of a pragmatic approach. Mm-hmm. How that works in practice.
Maybe I could try to talk a little bit about the practice part of it. So the National Security Council, our role in the US government is to try to coordinate policy processes among different agencies. And the Obama administration actually created the office that I'm now in, the Global Engagement Office, I think to try to do a lot of what you're talking about, is how do you bring soft power tools together with our hard power tools in order to find the right mix, which is going to be different for every challenge in every different country. And so our goal of our office is to be able to sit at a policy table when we're talking about whether it's repression of the Cuban people or the difficulty with the South China Sea, and be able to talk about how we can bring soft power tools into the conversation. And there are very kind of different models. We were having this incredible conversation beforehand about the British Council and how they have some independence from the British government, and that allows them to focus much more on longer term international cultural relations. I hope I'm summarizing that somewhat accurately. And in our government, we used to have something that was similar, and we actually merged it into the State Department back in the late 90s. And part of the thinking behind that was so that when you are addressing problems, you have all the tools, the levers of national power, so that you can bring them to bear on a problem.
Good evening. My name is Christopher Dujardin. Messaging is a key tool in countering violent extremism, or at least one of the tools. With the age of social media, how can the West do a better job in getting its message out first and out louder than the other side?
I'm not sure that getting it out louder is necessarily going to get us to our goals. I think the way that social media has allowed any individual around the world to have a voice, to create a video that goes viral, to take an online movement offline and be able to make impact in a community, actually means that we need to look much more at networks and partnerships rather than being the loudest or having the most media entities or having the biggest journalist tell your story. That's certainly a part of it, but I think the issues of credibility and having others who feel the same way and are espousing the same views is in some ways more useful, because a lot of people no longer trust authority and institutions and government and even media in many places around the world. They get their news from Facebook. They believe what their friends are telling them. And so the direction that we're heading in terms of working with partners and creating relationships with people who share our goals, I think is meant to try to also be able to have influence over in the social media realm, even though we are just but one of many, many people in the online and traditional media world.
It's a provocative and interesting question as well. And I'd go along with, I completely agree with Courtney that being first or being loudest is really not the most important thing. What seems to be the game, if you're thinking strategically, I mean, there's the phrase contesting the space, which I guess what we're talking about here is winning the argument within the space. But there's also contesting the nature of the space. Like, how does it work? What are the protocols? How does communication work? So on Twitter, for example, we're just doing research with the Pray for Paris, Pray for Syria hashtags. And we find that the reply function is used for solidarity. It's to show solidarity, it's to share that you feel the same and to offer support. Whereas the retweet function is used for that. The reply function is used to argue and say, yeah, you're missing, what about this? What about Nigeria? Even though that was a year ago, or what about this? So you can, what's important, I suppose, if we're going back to the pluralist idea, is how do you configure a space that is on balance going to enable the widest possible variation of people who can speak, and that, from my point of view, would keep it an agonistic rather than antagonistic kind of framework. I mean, obviously the way in which Facebook would just alter, or change the like to a series of different kinds of emoticons, that's not just contesting within the space, that's contesting or reshaping how the space works. It's trying to cultivate a certain kind of conversation, a more positive and also a more commercially useful one. So we've got to get beyond just thinking, how do we win arguments within a given space? The nature of the public sphere is really complicated, and it's contested. So I think I would shift the question to, what is the game to contest the nature of the space? How is China trying to have its vision of the internet, or Europe? I mean, Europe has a completely different notion of the internet, I would argue, to the United States. We have the right to be forgotten. Our kind of bias coming after the Holocaust and the idea that if you saw your mother being raped, if that happened today, and there was someone with a smartphone, or you saw people being gassed, if we have a Holocaust today, there will be footage of that. Well, in Europe, we know things like that happen, and so we don't want the automatic thing to be that information is free, because that information might be painful, it might take an awful lot of trauma and working through to get beyond that. So our contesting the space is to create a different notion of privacy, a different theory of information to the United States, where here it's a more it'll be fine, trust human nature on a kind of more liberal, optimistic view, maybe, compared to our kind of historical perspective. And then Brazil has its own internet, Iran, and so on and so on. So it's not, I know we've gone a long way from your question, but they're contesting the space and being first and quickest. You've got to decide what you're first and quickest into. That's the game.
Maybe two more questions.
My name is Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. I'll address my question to Mr. Ben because I heard your presentation in full. You started out and you made a point that sounds interesting, that Obama saying to Iran, unclench your fist, but you also said that it's the United States that needs to unclench its deadly, murderous, and sometimes very genocidal fist. And that's a balance. But then at the end you said, United States cannot apologize for all the bad things. I think they need to, because after doing all these wars and destruction that we've done, we need to apologize very heavily, whether we like it or not, that in order to bring some kind of a balance and send a message that, hey, let's all stop killing, and I'm going to do the same thing. For example, you talked about the beheading. Okay, fine. In the West, we propagandize that it's very barbaric. Okay, but just recently I looked at one of the bombing sites that was shown on the TV, a huge building where about 400, 500 people maybe living here in Washington. It looks like an apartment I live in. And United States Air Force crosshaired and blew it up. Now, and they called it an arsenal. Well, there may be some
give us a
arsenal.
question, please?
Yeah, I'm just coming to that. Arsenal, but you may have blown up, you may have vaporized like 400, 500 men, women, and children. And having done that, it's as much barbaric as beheading somebody, probably far more barbaric. So given that, United States needs to unclench itself and come clean in order to bring the two sides to understand. I mean, when United States bombed, or rather,
I think your point is taken.
Okay.
Do you have a question?
Nuclear bomb in Japan, it had to apologize. It hasn't, but it should.
Is there one more question in the room? Paul, you want
Nobody on this side has gotten a chance because the microphone's over there. Maybe we can.
Thanks.
This is working? Yeah. My question, I guess, is bringing it back to a little bit smaller. This is mainly for Courtney, but anyone else who knows anything about these processes would speak to this. When governments, such as the US government, but perhaps other governments that you're working with, study narratives and study these dynamics, two things come up. One is the problem of time, and to speak to your point about getting the whole picture about how people imagine their national futures and pasts, that research task is immense and very time-consuming. And the CVE thrust appears to be relatively new, although there is a body of research behind it. What is the time horizon that you're planning your projects for when you're monitoring things? And when you look at a narrative, what are the attributes, not the values for the attributes, what are the attributes you're looking for around a narrative or a narrative dynamic? Thank you.
To speak to the first question, well, we've already, somebody else has already said that it's very difficult for a US president to apologise because of the nature of US public opinion. You'd lose office. So you could do it knowing you would lose office, but my sense, I mean, I don't live here, but my sense of US public opinion is it doesn't like saying, yeah, sorry, Iraq, we did this. So the leadership might feel that, but that's not going to happen. But what changes the picture is digital. And again, this sounds a bit hypocritical, but the fact that everything is recorded or can be recorded, so you don't even know if it's been recorded, does mean that there is unprecedented possibility to hold people to account. So we see this, Abu Ghraib was the exemplar of this, but there are things that have happened that haven't come out yet. There must be. There are things that will happen that will come out. With digital, what you don't know is whether it's going to come out in 2 days or in 50 years. But at some point, apologies will be needed, and more apologies than we've had through the whole kind of colonial period, certainly from my country's point of view. So digital kind of, to the extent that it can be used, for example, as war crimes evidence, so to the extent that there is an ICC, you could hold leaders to account more easily than you could have 50 years ago because there's simply more digital traces of what's happened. There are some brilliant NGOs using satellite footage and user-generated footage in Syria and in Palestinian territories that you can use publicly available data to see where missiles have been fired from. You can trace their arc. You can triangulate the data to be pretty sure that this is where it came from, this is where it landed, this is what the damage was, in ways that were impossible 5 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. So there are reasons to be optimistic, even if the political climate and the public opinion climate kind of doesn't make it feasible. But technically, far more kind of accountability might be possible. I hope that kind of gives some answer to your question. And in terms of the narrative research, this is funded by the European Commission. We've got 3 years worth of funding. We've got researchers at universities in the Palestinian territories and in Ukraine who are going to be doing, I mean, it's not something you can do as a graduate master's dissertation. This is quite expensive, if you like. But there are enough people around universities that want to do this, because it's after the kind of tone deafness of the sentiment analysis that we've had. The problem is you don't want to be the human terrain team of 10 years ago, the anthropologists that kind of, you know, went into Afghanistan and lost their reputations. So as an academic who wants to inform policy and wants to inform civil society, there's a balance to be done with your narrative research. But I could happily talk to you about how to do it and what's feasible.
So on the narrative research, you know, I think to give an example of how you might be, or on the data and analytics and monitoring sentiment analysis, you know, I think one interesting hypothetical example is that if you know what the 3 towns are in the UK where there is the most radicalization, then how can you use data analytics? And I will preface this by saying that the United States has Privacy Act laws, and so we have a ton of restrictions on what we monitor and making sure that it's not US persons. But if you can go in and monitor what people in those 3 cities are tweeting, retweeting, looking at, linking to, and then you can work with, if you have a trusted government, to have programs in those cities to try to help do kind of face-to-face off-ramping or working with community leaders. You know, I think those are the types of ways that you can try to connect the fetish around digital to the real solutions that one might see on the ground to try to reduce radicalization.
Paul, did you want to ask a question? One last comment.
And I hope it's rather a practical question to conclude, but it derives from so many of the other statements that have been made. And I think it's a practical question that particularly picks up again on the first big question about, do we need a new kind of, are we going into an age, and do we need a new age of peace building and peacemaking? And my question is, do we need a new kind of diplomat and a new kind of negotiator in the world, perhaps at the highest level even of ambassadors? People who, yes, of course, go out and represent the interests of their country, obviously, but whose primary job is to actually understand the countries they're in and seriously and deeply return that back to the decision makers in their own country, such that they can truly listen, truly understand and send back, as it were, briefings which are not always about the political agenda and what the politicians are saying and doing in that country and what the economic variables are in that country, but which somehow have got through to an understanding of the culture and sociology and the uniqueness and the distinctions of the people, so they understand that country culturally, socially, theologically even.
That's the best explanation I've ever heard of what a public diplomacy officer is supposed to be doing overseas. And so I do agree with you. My hope is that the US government is training people to do that. I think because of the fact that the US Information Agency used to be outside, most of those people over the last 15 years since it's come inside haven't risen to become kind of leaders in embassies. And this gets to the point you made about if you're going to take something seriously, do you have leaders that really have those skills? And so the goal is to now be building a cadre of leadership that works around the world in our embassies that can do just that. I think one of the challenges we face is that all the resources are back here in Washington, and yet the expectations of our experts who can do that are all out in the field. And so how are we, through our centralization in DC, how are we getting the right tools out to the diplomats so they can do that? Because your average public affairs officer doesn't have necessarily access to big data, can't, because of security restrictions, be everywhere around the country to understand these things. And so I think the real challenge going forward is that given the importance of these issues of understanding, of being able to bring this expertise back to policymakers, is how are we building that leadership and giving them the tools they need to be able to do just that.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to you. Thank you for your time and for your energy.